The scent of smoke and salt water mingled in the morning fog. On the northern shores of Scandinavia, where the wind cuts the skin and the sea sings in a deep bass, men prepared for an expedition that could last more than 100 days. They knew, on this voyage, there would be no shops, no campfires on every shore, not even a guarantee of return. The question was singular: what to eat when the whole world turned into an icy desert? Historians write that an ordinary Viking consumed about 1.5 kilograms of food per day, mainly meat, fish, and grain. But on a ship, supplies are not endless, and 100 days at sea is a challenge even for modern seafarers. Archaeological findings in Birka and Hedeby show expeditions carried dried cod, salted meat, grain, and dried berries. All of this had to survive under sun and rain, not rot, and not become prey to mold. Within these provisions lay the true magic of survival. Dried cod became a source of protein that would not spoil for months. This product was called stockfish, fish dried in the wind without salt. For the northerners, it was like gold on the scales of fate, light, nutritious, and almost eternal. Imagine the sky gray, hands covered in salt, and in the mouth only a chunk of fish, hard as stone. To eat it, one had to soak it in water, often seawater, because fresh water was too precious. Stockfish was not just food, it was a symbol of the northern warriors' resilience. Their teeth crunched on it like swords on shields. But even such a diet required planning. A single ship could carry no more than 2 tons of cargo, and this included weapons, people, and horses. Every grain of oats mattered. Oats, this was the second life-saving product. From it, a gruel was made, similar to a liquid porridge, which warriors ate with wooden spoons directly from their palms. This dish was called grut. It did not provide strength like meat, but it saved them from hunger. Viking expeditions were not merely military campaigns, they were mobile cities on water. Each person was responsible for a portion of the supplies. The ship's hoofdingi, the chieftain, ensured that food was distributed evenly. To break order meant to jeopardize the lives of the entire crew, for if supplies ran out prematurely, hunger would become the most terrible enemy. And yet, even the most calculating chieftains could not foresee everything. What if a storm washed away part of the provisions? What if fish didn't enter the nets? What if the dried meat began to rot? Then what the Vikings called camp stew came to their aid. Everything edible that remained was thrown into the cauldron. Sometimes bones, moss, and even leather straps ended up in it. This is not a legend. Archaeologists have found remnants of such soups in the fire pits of temporary camps in Norway. And yet, despite this harshness, the Vikings did not consider themselves poor. They were hunters on land and providers at sea. Their food was simple, but every spoonful was a victory over time and cold. For to survive 100 days at sea meant one thing: to prove to the gods that you were worthy of returning home. But the most astonishing thing was how they maintained strength, vigor, and even fighting spirit without vitamins or modern nutrition. For the true secret of Viking survival lay not in the food, but in how they managed to share it among themselves. And it is here that the story begins, where hunger becomes a test of humanity. The air smelled of smoke and sweat. On the fjord's shore stood dozens of men, sharpening knives, mending leather bags, tarring barrels. But it was not weapons that were central to their preparation, but what went into the hold: food. For a Viking, food was a weapon of endurance. Without it, you could not lift a sword, nor hold an oar. And thus, the gathering of provisions for a 100-day expedition became a ritual, almost sacred. Historians note that women played a key role in this preparation. It was they who smoked meat, brewed beer, and baked flax-bread, a thin, dry bread capable of being stored for months. Archaeological findings in Norwegian settlements show this bread was made from a mixture of barley and rye, without yeast, simply by drying it on hot stones. It was hard as leather, yet light and almost eternal. One such bread weighed less than a palm, but could save a life. Dry bread and fish, two main pillars of the diet. But there was another invisible hero, salt. For a Viking, it was worth almost as much as silver. It was obtained by evaporating seawater in iron cauldrons, and every gram went towards salting meat or fish. The process was called salting, and it could decide the fate of an expedition. Without salt, food turned into poison. With it, it became armor against time.
Imagine, in a huge wooden barrel bound with ox-hide straps lay layers of red meat sprinkled with salt crystals. The smell was pungent, astringent, as if the earth itself clenched its fists. This was salted meat, the main source of protein at sea. One piece could weigh almost half a kilogram, and no fewer than 20 such pieces were provisioned per warrior. But salted meat came at a price. The longer it lay, the more water it required to wash off the salt, and fresh water, a rarity, a treasure for which one could kill. Therefore, on the ship, water was conserved as oxygen is conserved in space today. Leather water skins were filled, not with fresh, but with rainwater collected from the sails. This was their liquid bread. Sometimes, when supplies dwindled, they diluted water with beer, weak, sour, but safe to drink. This beverage was called ilu. It did not intoxicate, but it saved them from thirst and dysentery. But food and drink alone were not enough. It was necessary to keep fire. Ordinary campfires on a ship were impossible. Smoke would suffocate. Flames would burn the sails. Then they used clay braziers, in which tinder, dry moss soaked in resin, smoldered. This moss, called tiurt, was the northern equivalent of coal. It provided heat, did not smoke, and allowed them to warm up gruel even in the rain. This is what the northern survival cuisine looked like, a mix of calculation, tradition, and despair. Every piece of food was not just sustenance, but part of a strategy. Even the distribution of rations was a matter of discipline. The Hufdingi ensured that no one ate more than the norm. To violate it meant to steal a comrade's life. But preparation for the expedition was not only logistics, but also a test of character. Young warriors, whom the elders called drengs, apprentices, had to undergo a trial. To live for a week only on hardtack and water, to prove they could endure the journey. This is not a legend. Such rituals are mentioned in Scandinavian sagas. They had to show not physical strength, but strength of spirit. For at sea, the main thing is not muscles, but patience. When the ship was ready, provisions packed, barrels tightly sealed with pitch, the hardest part began. Farewell. Women prayed by the fire, throwing grains of oats into the flames, a symbol of satiety. Men were silent. The wind carried the scent of smoke and salt. Everyone knew. If the calculation was wrong, if the meat spoiled, if a storm broke the barrels, then death would come not from a sword, but from hunger. It is written that before sailing, a warrior ate his last home-cooked meal. Meat, onions, a little cheese. This was not just dinner, but a farewell to the taste of life. Beyond that, only sea, salt, and iron. But it was in these harsh conditions that Vikings transformed from simple farmers into living legends. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the ship slowly glided away, leaving behind foam and the shadows of those who believed that the food prepared by their hands would endure 100 days and 100 storms. But what awaited ahead was far more terrifying than any storm, a trial that would make the gods themselves turn away. The first days of the expedition were deceptively calm. The sea seemed benevolent. The wind blew steadily, and the sails filled with a sound like the breath of a giant. The men worked in rhythm with the oars, sang ancient songs, and the hold, full of food, inspired confidence.
But it was in this calm that the first trap lay hidden. Supplies spoiled not from time, but from carelessness. One poorly sealed opening in a barrel, and all the salted meat turned into a sticky, rotten nightmare. Historians write that Vikings strictly monitored food hygiene.
Every day they checked barrels, wiped away condensation, and moved fish from place to place to prevent air stagnation. This process was called preserving the breath of food. Not by chance, spoiled food could contaminate the entire hold. At sea, there is no second chance. But even carefully prepared provisions did not save them from hunger when a storm kept the ship in place. In such situations, the ancient law of the sea, equal share, came into effect. This was an unwritten principle by which food was divided into equal portions, regardless of rank. Even the Hofþingi ate the same salted meat as his seamen. For Vikings, this was not just fairness, it was the foundation of trust. Break this balance, and the crew would explode like an overheated cauldron. One of the key elements of their diet was butter. Not modern butter, but a thickened, sour milk fat, similar to soft wax. It was wrapped in leather and hidden in the shadows of the hold. It smelled like decaying grass, but provided energy like meat. Researchers have found traces of such a product in archaeological findings in Trelleborg and Gamla Uppsala. For Vikings, it was what an energy bar is today, only without sugar and advertising. Imagine the morning of the fourth day of sailing. Fog, soaked sails, and warriors sitting on board, chewing sour porridge made of oats and butter. It stretched like tar, but gave them strength to row. The smell of sour milk mingled with sea salt and sweat. Their whole body was sticky, but no one complained, because everyone knew there were still 96 days ahead. But the first weeks are always the most deceptive. While there is still meat, while the stomach is not empty, the warriors sing. Then the first storm comes. Waves like walls hit the side. The wind tears the sails. Water splashes directly into the hold, and all the precious food is in danger. To preserve it, Vikings used leather covers stretched over barrels, and some even poured wax over the top layer of salted meat. This was their ancient method of preservation, waxing. Archaeologists have found traces of wax on the walls of ancient barrels in the Trondheim area, evidence that Vikings knew how to protect food, no worse than they protected life with a sword. This technique saved them from mold, but not from salt water. And if a wave flooded the hold, the food absorbed salt, becoming bitter and almost inedible. Then it was dried directly on the deck, with pieces laid out in the wind. The smell was terrible, but it was the smell of survival. One of the most terrible enemies, not the storm, not enemies, but boredom. Weeks of the same thing, fish, bread, porridge. The body craved fresh food. Then the Vikings caught sea fish directly from the board, using primitive fishing rods. The most valuable catch, cod and herring. They ate them raw, immediately after gutting. This method was called living meat of the sea, not out of savagery, but out of necessity. Raw fish saved them from scurvy. Scientists from the University of Copenhagen found traces of vitamin C in Viking remains, meaning they truly ate fresh fish, and sometimes even herbs growing on coastal rocks. Their instinct for survival was more accurate than any textbook. But even with food, they had another concern: morale. One could live for several days without food, but not a single one without spirit. And so, every evening, when the wind subsided, the Vikings gathered around the central mast fire, small, sheltered from the wind. There they sang, remembered home, laughed, ate from a common pot, a gruel made from leftover fish, oats, and butter. This pot was called the galley circle. It was the heart of the ship. Those who did not share food were considered outcasts even on deck. For the Vikings knew
A loner would not survive. Only a shared spoon saved everyone.
Thus began their long journey, 100 days where every dawn was a victory and every spoonful of food was a gift from the gods. And as their ships glided over the waves, where sky and water merged into one, where every day was like the last, they did not yet know that soon the sea would take everything from them, except their will. More than 50 days passed. The sea became hostile and their bodies exhausted. The warriors no longer sang. Their shoulders were burned by the sun, their eyes stung by salt, and their hands were covered in cracks where sea grime accumulated. Supplies were almost exhausted. Salted meat had turned into a gray crystallized lump. Bread began to break like old bone, and oats, soaked with dampness, began to sprout directly in the sacks. It was then that the Vikings encountered what they feared most: hunger.
Archaeological findings at shipwrecks off the coast of Scotland show, in the last weeks of voyages, Vikings indeed lost a significant portion of their supplies. Historians write that some crews perished not from battles, but from exhaustion. And when nothing remained in the hold but rotten remnants, the struggle for every piece began. But even then, there was order. Vikings believed that violating the fair division of food meant inviting a curse. An ancient law stated, "He who steals food at sea steals the breath of the gods." Therefore, even in despair, they divided everything equally. Only now the rations decreased. A piece of bread the size of a palm was shared among 3. Gruel was diluted with seawater to make it seem like there was more. And yet, at some point, supplies became too scarce. Then, what was previously considered inedible came into use. Leather straps, shoe soles, pieces of sails soaked in water were softened and chewed to trick the stomach.
This is not fiction. Traces of processed leather with human tooth marks have been found in archaeological layers of Viking coastal settlements. This is what hunger, clad in iron, looked like. Amidst these sufferings, they had one remaining salvation: hunting at sea. When the storm subsided, warriors threw spears into the water, trying to catch at least a seabird or a seal. Seal meat was considered sacred. It provided warmth and fat, and from its blood a thick soup was made. This dish was called blodsuppe, literally blood broth. They drank it hot, standing on deck, to regain strength. The hot blood burned the mouth, but brought back the taste of life. This drink became a symbol of the extreme limit of human endurance. Scientists today know that animal blood indeed contains iron and vitamins capable of sustaining the body in conditions of exhaustion. Vikings, not knowing chemistry, knew life. They felt that blood was life in a literal sense.
One term that reflects this philosophy is nerfing.
This was the name for a state of extreme exhaustion, when the body no longer obeys but the person still acts. Nerfing was a test of will for Vikings. If you continued to row, despite not being able to stand, you became closer to the gods. This term appears in sagas as a synonym for glory. Imagine this scene: a gray sea, a deck covered in a crust of salt. Dozens of weathered men sit silently, each holding a wooden bowl of liquid porridge. The wind snatches steam from it, as if it itself wants to steal the last calories. And somewhere among this, the Hofdingi, the very chieftain who now eats the same as his men. He has the same sunken cheeks, the same cracked lips. This is the moment when the differences between strong and weak disappear. Only the living and the dead remain. But it was precisely in such moments that the true strength of the Northerners was born.
Not in victories, not in plunder, but in this stubborn silence in the face of nature.
Each of them knew that to survive meant not just to live through the day, but to preserve honor. For to return home empty-handed was a disgrace, but to die with a spoon in hand was an honor. It is written that in the darkest days of their expeditions, Vikings began to sing special songs, Drapur. These were not battle hymns, but stories of home, of fields, of the smell of fresh bread. They sang not for the gods, but for themselves, to keep from going mad. These songs were their last meal.
food for the soul. And when the waves finally subsided, when the wind stopped howling, they looked up at the sky and saw land ahead. This was not a miracle, but a reward for endurance. And yet, even after stepping ashore, they did not know if they could eat. Their stomachs, accustomed to hunger, would not accept ordinary food. Their bodies trembled, but their eyes burned. Because now they knew the price of every piece of bread, every drop of water. Thus, amidst storms and hunger, the very legends that would later become sagas were born. But ahead lay the main trial, returning home, where not a feast awaited them, but another, far more bitter lesson. When land finally appeared from the fog, the warriors no longer rejoiced. Joy is a luxury for the well-fed. They remained silent, gazing at the horizon, where a thin strip of land shimmered in the haze. Of the 100 men on the ship, 80 remained alive. The others died, quietly, without a cry, simply ceasing to breathe at dawn. Their bodies were given to the sea, wrapped in canvas. The salty waves became their graves. And yet the survivors rode on, because they knew now every spoonful of food they had brought would be proof of their strength. When the ship ran aground, the Vikings collapsed directly onto the sand. It smelled of earth and smoke, a scent they hadn't felt for months. They did not rush to the food. First, they were silent. Then they began to drink water in small sips so as not to die of thirst immediately. Only after several hours did they open the barrels where remnants of salt, oil, and bread had survived. These products, having endured the storm, became sacred to them. Historians believe that after such expeditions, Vikings performed a special ritual of gratitude to the gods. It was called bloat, a sacrifice in thanksgiving for survival. But contrary to stereotypes, they most often sacrificed not animals but food, a slice of bread, a piece of fish, a little oil. For a person who had endured 100 days of hunger, such a gift was worth more than gold. Archaeologists have found remnants of such sacrificial pits in the areas of Uppsala and Leira. They contained charred grains and fish bones, confirming the truth of the sagas. This was an act not of fear but of respect, for food that saved a life became a symbol of life itself. But the joy of return did not mean the end of suffering. Many of the survivors suffered from exhaustion, cramps, and inflammation. Chronicles mention that warriors often lost teeth. Salt and acid destroyed enamel. Some developed sea-bone disease, joint inflammation from constant dampness and lack of vitamins. Their bodies were broken, but their spirit was not. It was then that the second stage of the trial began: recovery. Vikings did not just eat to fill themselves. They ate slowly, with gratitude, as if learning to live anew. Women prepared them a thick gruel of oats and milk, mjölssupa. This drink restored strength, warmed the stomach, and allowed the body to adjust to food. Every sip was a step towards life. But the strongest trial awaited them not in the body, but in the soul. For 100 days at sea transformed a person. He could no longer look at bread without remembering the salt, could not eat meat without recalling the smell of rot. These warriors returned different, and although they were called heroes, deep down they knew victory came at too high a price. One saga says, "He who has eaten the salt of the gods will not be the same." Scholars believe this is a poetic description of the psychological consequences of long expeditions. And indeed, after prolonged hunger, a person loses taste, the feeling of fullness, even the ability to sleep. Many veterans of expeditions never went to sea again. They stayed on shore, built ships, taught the young. They were called huskarls, those who serve the house. The term huskarl was not just a title, but a sign that a person had endured too much. He became a keeper of experience, a memory of hunger and survival. And when young men asked them what it was like, 100 days without land, they answered, "It is like 100 winters in one heart." Sometimes festivals were held in the villages in honor of the returning seafarers.
A long table was set at the feast,
But the most honored places were occupied not by the Hofþingar, but by those who had shared the last piece of bread. Dishes of fish, oats, and dried meat, the same food that saved them at sea, were placed on the table. The feast was not a celebration of abundance. It was a farewell to hunger. Every piece reminded them of those who did not return. It is written that before sitting down at the table, Vikings uttered a short oath. "We ate salt together, therefore we will die together." This phrase became a symbol of loyalty, which later Scandinavian retinues passed down from generation to generation. And when night fell upon the land, and the fire reflected in their eyes, they knew food could be a weapon, a prayer, and a memory all at once. It made them mortal and immortal simultaneously. But the story of the Vikings does not end there.
for from these expeditions was born one of the most enduring legends, the myth of northern resilience, which many would later try to replicate, but few would endure. When it all ended, and the ships stood on the shore, the surviving Vikings looked at the sea as one looks at an old enemy, with respect and fear. They knew the sea does not kill without reason. It tests with hunger, cold, loneliness, and those who endured 100 days, it makes stronger than steel. But the true lesson of these expeditions is not in endurance, but in humanity. For the secret of Viking survival was not in fish, not in bread, and not in salt. It was in the fact that they shared everything, even hunger. No one ate alone. No spoon was raised until the others had received theirs. This was their invisible weapon, stronger than any sword. Modern archaeologists find traces of communal meals in burials from those times, bowls with several spoons, remnants of a single porridge in multiple places. Even death did not break their circle. They died together as they lived together. And here is a question for you. If you were among them, could you live 100 days, sharing the last piece of bread with someone weaker than you? Could you give up your own ration to save the crew? For the strength of the Vikings was not in their swords or their ships. It was in their ability to remain human when everything around them turned into hunger and storm. And perhaps this is the main lesson of their history, that it is not the strongest who survive, but those who share their last. Because even after 1,000 years, when the wind carries the scent of salt from the northern sea, somewhere within it echoes their whisper, "We ate salt together, and that is why we are alive."